with the 6th chapter of The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White. The Wart is trying to keep Madame Mim from eating him.
"Murderess!" cried the Wart. "You will rue ere this night is out." "Cobbling," said the witch. "It's a shame to kill him, that it is. Look how his little downy hair stares in the lamplight, and how his poor eyes pop out of his head. Greedy guts will be sorry to miss those eyes, so she will. Sometimes one could almost be a vegetarian when one has to do a deed like this."
The witch laid Wart over her lap, with his head between her knees, and carefully began to take his clothes off with a practiced hand. He kicked and squirmed as much as he could, reckoning that every hindrance would put off the time when he would be actually knocked on the head, and thus increase the time in which the black goat could bring Merlin to his rescue. During this time the witch sang her plucking song of "Pull the feather with the skin, not against the grain, oh, pluck the soft ones out from in, the great with might and main, oh, even if he wriggles, never heed his squiggles, for mercifully little boys are quite immune to pain." Oh, she varied this song with the other kitchen song of the happy cook. "Soft skin for crackling, oh, my lovely duckling, the skewers go here and the string goes there, and such is my scrumptious suckling." "You will be sorry for this," cried the Wart, "even if you live to be 1,000. "He has spoken enough," said Madame Mim. "It is time that we knocked him on his napper. Hold him by the legs, and when up goes his head, clip him with the palm edge, and then he is dead." The dreadful witch now lifted Wart into the air and prepared to have her will of him. But at that very moment there was a fizzle of summer lightning. Without any crash, in the nick of time, Merlin was standing on the threshold. "Ha!" said Merlin. "Now we shall see what a double first at Dom Danel avails against the private education of my master Blaise." Madame Mim put the Wart down without looking at him, rose from her chair, and drew herself to her full, magnificent height. Her glorious hair began to crackle, and sparks shot out of her flashing eyes. She and Merlin stood facing each other a full 60 seconds without a word spoken, and then Madame Mim swept a royal curtsy, and Merlin bowed a frigid bow. He stood aside to let her go first out of the doorway, and then followed her into the garden. It ought perhaps to be explained before we go any further that in those far-off days, when there was actually a college for witches and warlocks under the sea at Dom Danel, and when all wizards were either black or white, that there was a good deal of ill feeling between the different creeds. Quarrels between white and black were settled ceremonially by means of duels. A wizard's duel was run like this. The two principals would stand opposite each other in some large space, free from obstructions, and await the signal to begin. When the signal was given, they were at liberty to turn themselves into things. It was rather like the game that can be played by two people with their fists. They say 1, 2, 3, and at 3 they either stick out 2 fingers for scissors, or the flat palm for paper, or the clenched fist for stone. If your hand becomes paper when your opponent's is scissors, then he cuts you and wins. But if your hand has turned into stone, his scissors are blunted, and the win is yours. The object of the wizard's duel was to turn himself into some kind of animal, vegetable, or mineral which would destroy the particular animal, vegetable, or mineral which had been selected by his opponent. Sometimes it went on for hours. Merlin had Archimedes for his second. Madame Mim had the Gore-Crow for hers. While Hecate, who always had to be present in these affairs in order to keep them regular, sat on the top of a step-ladder in the middle to umpire. She was a cold, shining, muscular lady, the color of moonlight. Merlin and Madame Mim rolled up their sleeves, gave their surcoats to Hecate to hold, and later put on a celluloid eyeshade to watch the battle. Oh, and the latter put on a celluloid eyeshade to watch the battle. At the first going, Madame Mim immediately turned herself into a dragon. It was the accepted opening move, and Merlin ought to have replied by being a thunderstorm or something like that. Instead, he caused a great deal of preliminary confusion by becoming a field mouse, which was quite invisible in the grass, and nibbled Madame Mim's tail as she stared about in all directions for about 5 minutes before she noticed him. But when she did notice the nibbling, she was a furious cat in 2 flicks. Wart held his breath to see what the mouse would become next. He thought perhaps a tiger which could kill the cat, but Merlin merely became another cat. He stood opposite her and made faces. This most irregular procedure put Madame Mim quite out of her stride, and it took her more than a minute to regain her bearings and become a dog. Even as she became it, Merlin was another dog, standing opposite her at the same spot. "Oh, well played, sir!" cried the Wart, beginning to see the plan. Madame Mim was furious. She felt herself out of her depth against these unusual stonewalling tactics, and and experienced an internal struggle not to lose her temper. She knew that if she did lose it, she would lose her judgment, and the battle as well. She did some quick thinking. If whenever she turned herself into a menacing animal, Merlin was merely going to turn into the same kind, the thing would become either a mere dog fight or stalemate. She had to alter her own tactics to give Merlin a surprise. At this moment, the going went on. At this moment, the gong went for the end of the first round. The combatants retired to their respective corners, and their seconds cooled them by flapping their wings, while Archimedes gave Merlin a little massage by nibbling with his beak. "Second round," commanded Hecate. "Seconds out of the ring. Seconds out of the ring. Time!" Clang went the gong, and the 2 desperate wizards stood face to face. Madame Mim had gone on plotting during her rest. She had decided to try a new tack by leaving the offensive to Merlin, beginning by assuming a defensive shape herself. She turned into a spreading oak. Merlin still stood baffled under the oak for a few seconds. Then he most cheekily, and, as it turned out rashly, became a powdery little blue tit, which flew up and sat perkily on Madame Mim's branches. You could see the oak boiling with indignation for a moment, and then its rage became icy cold, and the poor little blue tit was sitting not on an oak, but on a snake. The snake's mouth was open, and the bird was actually perching on its jaws. As the jaws clashed together, but only in the nick of time, the bird whizzed off as a gnat into the safe air. Madame Mim had got it on the run, however, and the speed of the contest now became bewildering. The quicker the attacker could assume a form, the less time the fugitive had to think of a form which would elude it. And now the changes were as quick as thoughts. The gnat was scarcely in the air when the snake had turned into a toad, whose curious tongue, rooted at the front instead of the back of its jaw, was already unrolling in a flick which would snap it in. The gnat, flustered by the sore pursuit, was bounced into an offensive roll, and the hard-pressed Merlin now stood before the toad in the shape of a moltern, which could attack it. But Madame Mim was in her element. The game was going according to normal rules now, and in less than an eye's blink, the toad turned into a peregrine falcon, which was diving at 250 miles an hour upon the heron's back. Poor Merlin, beginning to lose his nerve, turned wildly into an elephant. This move usually won a little breathing space, but Madame Mim, relentless, changed from a falcon into an olle in an instant. An olle was as much bigger than an elephant as an elephant is larger than a sheep. It was a sort of horse with an elephant's trunk. Madame Mim raised this trunk in the air, gave a shriek like a railway engine, and rushed upon her panting foe. In a flick, Merlin had disappeared. "1," said Hecate, "2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, but before the fatal 10, which would have counted him out, Merlin reappeared in a bed of nettles, mopping his brow. He had been standing among them as a nettle. The olle saw no reason to change its shape. It rushed upon the man before it with another piercing scream. Merlin vanished again, just as the thrashing trunk descended, and all stood for a moment looking about them, wondering where he would step out next. "1," began Hecate again. But even as she proceeded with her counting, strange things began to happen. The olle got hiccups, turned red, swelled visibly, began whooping, came out in spots, staggered 3 times, rolled its eyes, fell fumbling to the ground, it groaned, kicked, and said farewell. The Wart cheered. Archimedes hooted till he cried. The gore-crow flew down dead, and Hecate, on top of her ladder, clapped so much that she nearly tumbled off. It was a masterstroke. The ingenious magician had turned himself successfully into microbes not yet discovered, of hiccough, scarlet fever, mumps, whooping cough, measles, and heat spots, and from a complication of all these complications, the infamous Madam Mim had immediately expired. And that's the end of chapter 6.